Hello all. Welcome to our second distance learning lecture, and this we are going to expand on the idea of climate and factors that influence climate, and we're going to start talking about life on our planet, and we're going to do that in the way of biomes. And so we've talked about that there's different areas on our planet that receive different amounts of these factors, being things that control temperature and precipitation. And then now we're going to start generalizing those as to, because of these factors and because of things that they're doing, what kind of life can exist there. And that's what a biome is. So by the end of today, you should be able to address the idea of how photosynthesis controls the distribution of life on planet Earth. So keep that in the back of your mind, because that's kind of where we're going. Maybe. All right, so what are biomes? Biomes are basically just an area that can be classified. So an area on our planet that can be classified based on the type of life that exists there. And what controls that are the temperature, the soil, the amount of water, things of that are all the things that control what type of life can be there, is whether or not they can have access to these factors that control a specific thing, which we're going to get to in a minute. And different biomes have different life. And so I chose this picture because I thought it was kind of cool, because it shows that there, even if I have different ecosystems, so being a kelp forest and an island, those are two different ecosystems, I would still consider them being one biome, because a biome is a bigger idea. So a biome really is kind of like, hey, given these climate factors, what type of life would you expect to find there and why? So what makes up a biome? Well, there's going to be two main categories of things, being abiotic factors and biotic factors. Abiotic factors are things that are not alive, and so water, sun, nutrients, etc. Whereas biotic factors are things that are alive. So the type of plants and animals that exist in a given area. Abiotic factors are largely what determine what biotic factors are there, because the biotic factors are going to have to try to gain access to the abiotic factors that are available. And if they can adapt and access them, then they can survive. And so the more life that can access these abiotic factors, the more life you can have, okay? And so start kind of thinking about those two things. We're really going to focus on these abiotic factors and how those change. And therefore, when they change, it changes what type of life can be there. The more life I can have, the more diversity I can have, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of a big snowball effect. So we've already talked about the two main abiotic factors that we're going to talk about today, because we talked about them as the fact that they control climate, right? We talked about precipitation and temperature are the two main things that control the type of climate that you would experience on our planet. And so it's probably not a surprise to you that we're going to come back to that idea, and we're going to talk about how does average annual temperature and how does average annual precipitation control where biomes exist, because they are going to control where things can happen and where things can live. And so if I have a lot of water, so a lot of the abiotic factor of water, and I have a high temperature, so I have a lot of sun and energy, then I'm going to be able to have a lot of life, and that is a tropical rainforest, okay? And then if I have a lot of temperature but not a lot of water, well, then I'm down here in the desert, okay? And if I have no temperature and no water, then I'm over here in permanent ice and tundra and things like that. So these two factors work together to determine what type of life can be existing, because they really do control that climate. And those factors are going to control a big thing that is controlling kind of the basis of whether or not life can exist. And that is the idea of photosynthesis. Now, photosynthesis is the idea that an organism can tap into these abiotic factors and turn them into biotic things, okay? So we are not photosynthetic. We cannot go out and lay out in the sun for lunch and be full at the end of it, okay? We don't have the ability to tap into that abiotic factor and turn it into something usable for the environment. And this is a disadvantage for us because we have to then consume something else that has had the ability to tap into that energy in order for us to gain energy. A reminder that energy is neither created nor destroyed, it's only transformed. And so the type of energy that is coming to our planet, the most amount of it and the abundance of it is radiant energy, right? The sun shines down on the earth. That energy is reaching the surface of our planet. And if we then need to somehow turn that into a usable energy for us, we have to have these organisms that have the ability to do that. And they do that through photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is that process. It's that process of taking that radiant energy and turning it into something that not only the plant can use, but then consumers like us can eat and gain that energy. So it's how a whole biome is able to tap into the energy provided by the sun. And so we're going to take a little detour and we're going to talk about photosynthesis. We're going to talk about how it works and why it works and kind of what do we need to have it to work. And then we're going to come back to talking about biomes. So what is photosynthesis? It's just what I said. It's the idea that organisms can tap into the sun's radiant energy and turn it into a chemical energy, which is necessary to like start the food chain. Okay, so then consumers are going to eat your producers, and that's going to gain access to the radiant energy kind of by proxy. So I woke up in the morning and I had strawberries for breakfast. Well, the strawberries had gained that energy, that sugar that's inside the strawberry originated as radiant energy from the sun, and then the plant went through photosynthesis and stored that energy as sugar in the strawberry. Okay, and so these organisms that are able to do that are called producers because they literally produce chemical energy for a biome. Okay, that's kind of their job, is to be able to take that abiotic factor of sun and convert it into something that something else can use to gain energy and be able to survive. So this is the balanced chemical equation that we're looking at with photosynthesis, and I'm sure you have seen this before, at least I hope you have. And it is just that light comes into the plant. The plant then not only uses that radiant energy, but it's going to use carbon dioxide and water, and it's going to rearrange those to produce glucose, which is this big molecule here, and oxygen gas, okay? We're going to focus on the reactants, which are this side of the equation, and we're going to be talking about how do those reactants work and what actually limits plants, like what ones are those are limiting in order to produce these, okay? And more of this I can produce, the more consumers I can support. You can think of it that way, okay? So if I can produce more of this stuff, I can have more life available to on the area of the planet. So what does photosynthesis need? It needs three main things. It needs sun, it needs water, it needs carbon dioxide, okay? I showed this picture because this is actually happening in my front yard right now with my tulips. I have a tree that shades where my tulips are. And so the plant that is closest to my tree, which would be this guy, is not receiving as much sunlight as this one over here. And so it's a little photosynthesis experiment right in my front yard. But it also shows how these things can be limiting given everything else is the same. So they're receiving the same amount of carbon dioxide because they're in the same area. They're receiving the same amount of water because I water them all at the same time. But the thing that is changing is the sunlight. And so if I have less sunlight, I get less photosynthesis. More sunlight, I get more photosynthesis. So each one of these can have a limiting effect on the amount of growth a plant does, and thus the amount of sugar or those products that it can produce. If I can have more of these guys, I get more of the output, okay? So we're gonna go through each one of these reactants and talk about not only what is it doing, but how could it be limited on our planet. So the first is the sun, okay? So the radiant energy comes down, it shines down on a plant, and there are pigments in plants that can tap into that. That's what we don't have, but a plant has, okay? And they have these things called chloroplasts that contain a pigment called chlorophyll, which I actually, that's its job, is to capture the energy from the radiant energy from the sun. And it's actually using it to split water molecules apart to get the kind of, like, I think of it as Lego pieces that it needs to build the glucose molecule. Okay. But and different plants have different pigments. Okay, so they don't only just have chlorophyll. Chlorophyll's the most common. It reflects green light. That's why your plants appear green. Okay, and it absorbs all other wavelengths of light. Okay, but other plants have different pigments, so you can kind of think of it as different colors of plants are going to be absorbing different types of light, and therefore they can adapt to different locations on Earth. But chlorophyll being the mass majority of what plants are going to be using is the one that we talk about the most. Okay. Now, what is going to limit the amount of sunlight a plant gets on our planet? If we're talking a global scale, well, it's mainly going to be limited by latitude, right? If I'm closer to the equator, I'm receiving the most amount of direct sunlight, and I receive it all year round. Okay. And then as I move further north and south, I get more indirect sunlight, so I don't get as much radiant energy. And as that happens, then I get less. That's going to become my limiting factor as I move north or south from the equator. Excuse my phone ringing. The other thing that's going to limit this is the season. So remember that our Earth is tilted, and so when I'm tilted towards the sun, so like we're moving into northern hemisphere summer, I am going to be able to get more radiant energy in a given day than when I am tilted away. Okay, so when I'm tilted away, I get less radiant energy in a given day. Towards, I get more. And so plants are then going to adapt in order to maximize the amount of photosynthesis they're doing given those seasonal variations. And so seasonal variations are only going to affect regions or latitudes that would have an impact of those seasonal variations. Like around the equator, I never have seasonal variations, so that's not what's going to limit me. But as I move north or south, those seasonal variations greatly affect the amount of photosynthesis that takes place. That's why in our winter, our leaves fall and they die, and our plants stop going through photosynthesis. And then this time of year, they start to bud and they start to actually produce leaves to be able to go through photosynthesis again. The next reactant was water. And so water and nutrients both are going to be absorbed by the roots. Okay, and these are going to then be transported to the leaves to be able to go through photosynthesis, because photosynthesis is happening in the leaves. That's where the chloroplasts are. That's where the radiant energy is being absorbed. And so this is going to be limited by the amount of precipitation that is taking place in a given area. So if I have a lot of precipitation, I have a lot of access to water, then I'm going to be able, that's not going to limit me. That's not going to limit my photosynthesis. But the less water I have, the less photosynthesis I can be going through. A reminder of things that kind of control precipitation, you're going to think about like high pressure zones versus low pressure zones, where low pressure zones have rising air, so you're going to get more precipitation. High pressure zones have sinking air, less precipitation, really anywhere. So a windward side of a mountain versus a leeward side of a mountain, more precipitation on the windward side, and I can have more photosynthesis happening there. I have more life kind of things versus the leeward. Anywhere where I can have that rising air and I can get that precipitation, I'm going to get more life. Okay, I'm going to get more photosynthesis. I'm going to get more life. So water being limited by whether or not I can have rain. The last reactant is carbon dioxide. And believe it or not, carbon dioxide is not limiting. It really isn't. We have too much of it in our atmosphere. It's not a limiting factor. Carbon dioxide goes in and enters through pores called stomata, which are in the leaves of plants, or actually on the underbelly of plants, so it doesn't lose too much water as the oxygen escapes, and it doesn't want to dry out the plant too much, and it needs that water to go through photosynthesis. But carbon dioxide enters, and it then is providing kind of, again, those Lego pieces, those building blocks to create the glucose and then the oxygen gas. And so it is not limiting. It is very abundant in our atmosphere. And so we never really talk about carbon dioxide as being what is going to limit photosynthesis and therefore what is going to limit life. We really only talk about it's sun limiting and is water limiting. And so those are the two things that we think about. So at the end, what this is all producing is going to be that glucose and that oxygen. And so it's going to producing that food. Now, believe it or not, plants are not put on this planet for the sole purpose of us being able to survive. They produce glucose for themselves so that they can eat. They're producing their own foods. That's why they're called producers. They're also called, I just lost the word. Anyways, something. I can't think of the word that I was trying to say. Anyways, it's producing food for itself, and it's then producing oxygen as a byproduct, which then we use in cellular respiration. This, again, the whole process of photosynthesis is taking that abiotic factor of radiant energy and it's turning it into something useful for the rest of the biome. And so the more photosynthesis I can go through, the more life I can support. So here's kind of where we start to put this all together. Primary productivity is the amount of photosynthesis happening in the area. Okay, so we talk about primary productivity a lot. If I have more primary productivity, if I have more photosynthesis, I have more energy available, and therefore I have more life. If I look at an energy pyramid, which is something we will get to probably later as we start to talk about things, but I have, here's my big abiotic factor of the sun, right? Here's light energy. The more things that can tap into that, being the base of this pyramid, the bigger my base is, the taller my pyramid can get. If I have a really skinny base, I can't have a very tall pyramid. I have to have a big fat base, and then I can build more layers. The bigger this base is, the more layers I can have, and the more types of organisms I have, the more diversity of life I can have, because I have more options for accessing this energy, which I don't have access to as a consumer. And so primary producers or producers in general are going to be things that have access to that abiotic factor of radiant energy, or have that ability to tap into those abiotic factors and produce something that then other things can consume. The more I have of this, the more life I can have, okay? So I bring back this graph, and as we talked about this, precipitation and temperature are two of our three reactants of photosynthesis, right? If we think of our three reactants, we have carbon dioxide, we have light, and we have water. Well, I told you carbon dioxide is never limiting, never, ever, ever limiting. Okay, we have too much of it. It's not a thing of whether or not we have enough of it. But the two things that are limiting, amount of sunlight, right? Because that's going to limit photosynthesis, and then amount of water. So if I have abundance of both, I get tropical rainforest. I get the most diverse places on the planet, right? So I get tropical rainforest where I can have a huge pyramid of things, and I have huge diversity of life. And that is what I get. If I go to the other extreme and I have low temperatures and low precipitation, I have something like the tundra, I get a very low diversity of life. There is not a lot of organisms that can adapt to those low temperatures and can adapt to that low precipitation. And I have a very small pyramid, a very little photosynthesis going on. So it's a very small pyramid, and therefore I don't have a lot of diversity of life. So let's start kind of bringing this together and let's compare. This week, you're going to do a lot of investigating on what are biomes, what are the different biomes, and you're going to identify them and kind of the different characteristics of each. And then you're going to be able to relate that to the amount of photosynthesis availability. And through that, I want you to think about how much light is available, how much water is available. Is that going to make me have a lot of photosynthesis or a little bit? If I have a lot of photosynthesis, I have a lot of life. If I have a little bit of photosynthesis, I have a little bit of life, or a low diversity. So these are the two kind of classic examples, I think, when everybody talks about biodiversity or talks about biomes. They talk about a tropical rainforest and they talk about a desert, mainly because they tend to have very similar amounts of radiation available, or a very, I mean, it's a scale, but they tend to be within a very similar zone. Now, the difference is the precipitation. So tropical rainforests tend to be closer to the equator. They tend to be closer to that area where you have the rising air. You have that air heating up, it's rising, it's picking up water, and then it is dumping it all onto the land. And it's giving these really lush areas that can support these massive energy pyramids, and can support life like I think that's a jaguar. I don't know. It's a pretty big cat. But it can support these really big predators. Whereas something like a desert, you're not going to see big predators like that. You're going to see kind of smaller predators like this, because there's not a lot of photosynthesis happening on there, because there's not a lot of water. I have sinking air, I have a dry climate, and I'm not going to be able to support the diversity of life that would lead to being able to have a top predator like this. I'm going to have one that's a lot more simplified, a lot more less life, and I'm not going to be able to support as much. I'm not going to see as much. It's not that I'm going to see, I'm going to see life, like life can exist. I'm just not going to see as much diversity of life in a desert. And the things that exist in a desert have to be adapted to the fact that there's not a lot of water, right? Because that's even another abiotic factor that everything on life needs. Okay, so not only are they not being able to have photosynthesis and thus the energy availability, they're also not able to have water. So kind of thinking about those two things. Here are another two examples. This would be a temperate forest with the moose. This would be like, I mean, Colorado can be a carnivorous forest or temperate. We're probably more carnivorous than we are temperate, but think of something like that, like a forest versus a tundra, okay? In the forest, if I'm just comparing these two, so both of these we're moving up in latitude, so seasonality is going to be your big kind of one of your big changes in temperature and your big distributing factors. In the spring, in a forest, you get a boom of life. You get babies born, you get flowers, you get all these trees budding and pollen and things like that happening, because all that photosynthesis begins to pick up, right? And then in the winter, the leaves go away, or you're in the fall, the leaves go away, and then the forest kind of goes to sleep. Like you don't see a lot of abundance of life in the winter. And then if I have something like the tundra, I have to have things that are extremely adapted to a low precipitation, low temperature environment and can survive like that. So again, my pyramid's itty bitty. It's tiny because there's really not a lot of photosynthesis going on, and they have to be able to access their energy from other sources. A lot of them are dependent on things in the ocean that are coming up and that are, basically are migrating up to that area, and then they eat things that show up in the ocean, rather than a lot of things that live on land, okay? Because there's not a lot of abundance of life in something like the tundra. So I hope this kind of lecture gave you a really good idea as to how photosynthesis relates to biomes, and how photosynthesis controls where we can live on, or not we, but where life can exist on this planet, and specifically what types of life can exist on this planet. And so big takeaways for today is I want you to remember that photosynthesis needs three things to happen. It needs carbon dioxide, it needs sunlight, and it needs water. And so carbon dioxide is never limiting, and it's not going to be what's controlling photosynthesis, but sunlight and precipitation are. And those are the two main factors that we talked about when we talked about climate factors and what control what type of climate you can predict. And really what biomes are just a specific climate zone that now we're talking about life that can exist there. The more water, the more precipitate, or the more water and the more sunlight I have, the more photosynthesis I have, the more life I have. Okay. So that's kind of your big takeaways from today. I hope you enjoyed, and let me know if you guys have any questions. And have a good day.